Welcome back to another episode of the Irish Breakdown podcast brought to you by FanDuel, part of the Believe Network. Happy Friday, ladies and gentlemen. And you guys know what that means. It's free-for-all mailbag time. But before
What
we get
is
there,
good, everybody? I'm ready to go. I always been fired up when I miss a show, Trev. Like when I have you guys do a show, I love it because I get a lot of work done. But man, it makes me fired up when I finally get back to the show. So I'm a little fired up. Trev had this real
it's good
professional intro, ready to go, and I couldn't help myself. I'm so excited about today.
Well, hey, man, it's good to have you back on the show. We are previewing, before we dive into the Friday free-for-all mailbag, we are previewing Notre Dame's final regular season opponent, which they'll be facing on the road, the Stanford Cardinal. Now, I believe there is no kickoff time yet for this game. I think it's still up in the air.
They're going to wait to see how bad Stanford is before they set the time for that game.
Yeah, and if that's the case, they may set the kickoff time on November 28th. We'll find out.
Well, part of it is going to be how good Notre Dame is too. If it's a game where Notre Dame, we'll see how it goes. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, it's going to be. We're going to have a great mailbag today. But yeah, Trev, like you said, we're going to finish our opponent preview series and talk about Stanford Cardinal and what an it's kind of they're last because they're just the last team on the schedule. We win in order of games played, but there'd be a lot of reasons to explain them being last. The most unique offseason, perhaps the worst team on your schedule, a whole lot of different reasons you could maybe have Stanford last, but gonna be fun to discuss the Cardinal today. Well, I shouldn't say fun. It's gonna be interesting discussing the Cardinal today.
It'll be something that we do, discuss the Stanford Cardinal today. But you're not wrong, Brian. This has been probably under the radar, a little bit more on Notre Dame fans' radars because Notre Dame plays them at the end of the regular season. But under the radar of nationally, of one of the most interesting off seasons that a program has had in college football. I mean, you go back and you look at, timeline of what's gone on with this school. And they've kind of been through the ringer. They hired Andrew Luck as the new general manager on November 30th of last year. And then March, stuff really started to pick up for them. They let go of head coach Troy Taylor on March 25th of this year. It took them about 6 days to find his replacement. They hired Frank Reich as the interim head coach on March 31st. At that point in time, they promoted current tight ends coach Nate Byam to offensive coordinator. Their defensive coordinator remains the same. And then recently, they hired John Donahue, former Nike CEO, as their athletic director on July 31st. So jam-packed offseason for the Stanford Cardinal, Brian. Definitely busy.
In a strange offseason, because in some ways, Trevor, you look at Stanford and say, boy, this just doesn't seem to be like a program, a school that cares about football success. But then there's some other things you look at this offseason and say, is this evidence that Stanford is making changes to say, hey, look, if we're going to have football, we better be good at it and we better, try to make some money off of it. And obviously bringing Andrew Luck back, I think, was step one of, does Andrew Luck take this job if it's just like, hey, man, let's manage our decline? We're not gonna win. We're not gonna do this. We're not gonna do that. I don't think that's something that Andrew Luck would. I mean, and it appears that this is a permanent position for him. This isn't like, hey, man, come in for a year, help us out, and leave, kind of like which is what Frank Reich is doing. But I think that's obviously I would assume, this is me reading between the lines. This isn't me telling you something that I know or intel or behind the scenes, but I'd be hard pressed to believe that Andrew Luck would be coming back and without some sort of assurances that, hey, we're going to be more committed to football. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And those type of things. And so I have to believe that was the case. And then, of course, the firing of their head coach, which was a very weird situation. They bring in Frank Reich, who has an interesting relationship with Andrew Luck. Obviously, he coached him for Frank Reich's first year as the head coach of the Colts was Andrew Luck's last year as an NFL quarterback. It would be the 2018 season before injuries derailed his career. So that was an interesting hire. It was clearly a get us through the off season or get us through this season. It's too late to go hire a permanent coach. But if Frank Reich does well, maybe he decides to keep the job, or maybe he decides he wants to stay in college football. So who knows how that's going to go? But just so much uncertainty and turmoil. And then they finally hired the athletic director. I think this is the move, Trevor, to me, that makes me think that Stanford football might be something that they prioritize to a degree. And then there's one other thing that you and I are going to talk about when we actually get into the roster breakdown. But they hired a businessman, not a guy that's really in athletics from the standpoint of he's been an AD, he's been a coach, he's been some administrative AD, something along those lines. This is a guy from the business world. Now, part of he's been at different companies, but a lot of his experience is working with sports. Obviously, if you're working at Nike, if you're higher up at Nike, sports is a big part of what you're appealing to. That tells me that Stanford is saying, hey, look, we have to embrace the new reality. If we're going to play Division I football, we have to pay $20.5 million in revenue. So we can't just, we're in the ACC. We're not getting a huge TV deal from the ACC. So we're going to have to do some things to raise more money. And so I think part of this is bringing in a businessman who can implement some strategies to make them more profitable. That's obviously step number one for you hiring a business person. There's obviously going to be some fundraising involved in this conversation that you think will help. But I also think that combine that with the Andrew Luck move, they do strike me as potential evidence that Stanford understands that being good at football is also something that's very important to creating revenue. And so we'll see if they can live that out. But so far, Trev, there's a lot of question marks surrounding the future of the Stanford program. And, obviously the Pac-12 blowing up was, I think them and Cal suffered more than anybody else because they didn't have homes. And really, a lot of them having a home has to do with Notre Dame and Jack Swarbrick and his connections and things that he did. But they're in a tough spot, Trev, because you've got one opponent in your region. You play them at their place every other year. So it's not like you've got that guaranteed one West Coast game every year. And they've got to travel real far away for a lot of their games. And it's a tough situation. Then obviously with the coach leaving, and they lost a ton from their roster, and it wasn't a very good roster to begin with. These guys are stepping into a really tough situation. Really tough.
Yeah, big picture. I love the moves. I love the fact that they brought in Andrew Luck. I like their decision for athletic director. I even like the interim head coach decision with Frank Reich. You're getting a guy with NFL head coaching experience to come in and take over, really this kind of mess that he was left with after Troy Taylor was let go. But I do think that the dividends of these investments of Andrew Luck, Frank Reich, and Donahue are not going to start to really show itself until 2026 because of how scattered this was. During all of their hires and during not including players that left for the draft, Stanford lost 27 players to the transfer portal while all of that stuff was going on. And so this is going to be a completely new look roster. It's going to be a new looking team. There's been coaching shifts. And so this year, it's going to be really interesting to see how Andrew Luck and how Frank Reich manage this program this year, because, Brian, there is a lot on their plate right now. A lot.
There really is. And you don't know how they're going to handle it. You really don't. I mean, it's you look at their schedule, and we'll obviously take a deeper dive into it, but their road games are at Hawaii. That's not close. I know, like, if your knowledge of Hawaii is like what you see on a paper map, you're like, well, it's like kind of like here's California and Hawaii's right there. No, it's actually in reality way out there. Their other road games they play at BYU. Provo, Utah is not exactly close to them. They play at Virginia, at SMU. Dallas-Fort Worth is not close to Stanford, California. At Miami, there's literally not a further place they could go than Miami for a game. At North Carolina. Like, those are their road games. And it's just, like you said, Trev, they're in a really tough spot. One of the things that they're going to have to do, and I think this is very important for Stanford, is in future scheduling, they're going to need to try to get into more 7-5 situations just to save money from the cost of travel. And, I realize that might for a while force them into some tricky, okay, our non-conference is pretty weak, but guys, you are so far away from being a national championship contender right now that shouldn't be your concern. Your concern should be rebuilding the program. and scheduling some winnable home games against lower level G5 teams or even an FCS opponent or two is something I think they need to do to get wins, number one, but then also somehow cut down on their travel schedule and just the wear and tear for the players on the trips they have to make. Because Stanford didn't ask for this. This isn't like USC. This isn't like UCLA and Oregon and Washington, who I get so tired of them whining about their travel, or Penn State whining about having to go out there. Well, you voted to have those teams in your league. Stanford didn't ask for this. If Stanford had their way, there'd still be a Pac-12. So I have more sympathy for them than I do a lot of these other teams that were affected by the travel that they have to incur because of all the conference realignment, because they're not a team that necessarily asked for that. So, and then you look at this team this season, Trev, and the reality is they weren't very good last year. And, I liked the Troy Taylor hire. I did. I thought it was a good hire. I liked what he did at Sacramento State. I thought he did a good job building that program up. And the reality is the improvement from year one to year two was minimal. There was improvement, and it may not look like it, but because you went 3-9 one year, 3-9 the next year. But I think when you look at Stanford in 2023, you had losses by 46 points. They lost by 7 points to Sacramento State, your head coach's former school at home. Lost by 1 point to Arizona. Okay, maybe they're going to be competitive. Then the wheels fell off. You lost by 36 to Oregon, 35 to UCLA, 9 to Washington at home, 45 to Oregon State, 12 to Cal, and then obviously lost by 33 to Notre Dame. And you look at the next year, and their points per game average only goes up 2.2. They dropped their points allowed average only by 4. They were a little bit more competitive, I would argue, this season, even though the final scores don't always show up. But they had a 7-point loss to TCU in what was a competitive game. They beat Syracuse on the road in a big win. They got blown out by Clemson. They got blown out by Virginia Tech, got blown out by Notre Dame, got blown out by SMU, and it's looking like same old Stanford. They lost 4 of their last 5 games, Trev, and one of them was a 31-point loss to NC State. But their other 3 losses to Wake Forest, Cal, and San Jose State were all by 3 points. And then they beat Louisville late in the year. So they at least battled more. They were more competitive down the stretch. But now that roster gets gutted in a lot of ways because of NFL departures and then obviously a bunch of guys transferring. And now you look at it and say, I don't know how they're going to handle that, because they just don't have, in my opinion, the kind of roster you need to really turn this thing around. So that's why I say you've got to have some realistic looks at yourself and say, we're a long way away. We've got to do things to lay a foundation. And it's kind of hard to do that when you've got a coach that's probably not going to be your coach for the future. And that makes it tough for players. Like, how are we going to be locked in when it's like, who am I playing for? I'm doing this for somebody else, or am I doing this to be, to look good in the portal? It's a tough situation for them to be in.
Yeah, it really is. And I know we're going to dive into it in a little bit, but their schedule this year doesn't make things that much easier. Comparatively, it's a little bit more favorable than what it was last year. You don't have a Clemson on the schedule. You still have Notre Dame on the schedule. But Stanford as a whole, I'm going to echo a lot of the same things that I said about Purdue. And honestly, it'll even be a little bit more tough than Purdue, because at least Purdue, when they hired the guy from UNLV, his name is escaping me right now.
Barry Odom.
Thank you. At least when Purdue hired Barry Odom, I said when we previewed Purdue, take wins and losses out of it, take margins of wins or margin of losses out of it. If you can establish some sort of team identity and some sort of culture, that's going to be a win for Purdue in year one under them, because they're coming off of such a horrific season. Brian, to your point, it's unclear what the future of Stanford holds right now with Frank Reich being an interim head coach. So it's even tough to say, well, as long as they can establish some sort of culture this year, because that culture may be leaving at the start of the 26 season or after the 25 season. So who knows? Mm-hmm. That's definitely going to be a question. But, you go back through and you look at what they did last season, it kind of makes sense why, FanDuel has them where they're at. FanDuel right now has Stanford. You mentioned earlier, you're kind of a long ways away from winning a national championship. They're tied for dead last in FanDuel odds at plus 10,000 to win a national championship. They have the same odds as Texas State, James Madison, and Purdue. And they have even further odds somehow to win the ACC. They have the lowest odds to win the ACC in FanDuel, plus 30,000. They're tied with Wake Forest. The next closest team is California at plus 13,000. And so Stanford, what FanDuel is kind of telling us is that they're going to be in for a rough ride this season. But Brian, it still furthers your point. They're a long ways away. This is going to be the definition of what rebuilding looks like for a football program.
It is. D-Rock Irish has a great post he put. I says, most mileage for away college football games this year. Number one, Hawaii, who's almost always number one. 14,812. Number two, Stanford at 11,762. And number three is Oregon, 8,371. So they are 34, almost 3,400 miles greater than any other Power 5 team in college football. And the only one that is more is a team who doesn't even whose home campus is not even connected to the continental United States. So it's rough. It's rough.
Yeah, it is. You talk about the losses that they had on offense and defense from the portal. I mean, they lost. You guys know some of the names. You know, they lose Emmett Mosley. He's gone. He goes to Texas. They lose David Bailey. He goes to Texas Tech. Alik Ayomaner elected to go to the NFL early. He was their best wide receiver last year. And I've seen some clips of him in training camp. He's kind of been tearing it up for the Titans a little bit. Good route runner. Ismail Sissy, he's going to Arkansas. Notre Dame's going to be facing him later this year. They still have a handful of players that are still left in the portal. Ashton Daniels transferred to Auburn. And what, conversation for a different day, but what I thought was an interesting move, considering how much Auburn's trying to.
Is he playing quarterback for them this fall? Or is he like making the switch? Like, that would be interesting to see.
That would be interesting. But outside of that, they also lost a lot of their production in terms of like NFL talent that has also departed. So between the transfer portal and between players electing to go to the NFL draft, this team is going to look completely different. And to counter their 27 outgoing transfers, the one thing that Brian and I were talking about before the show is they were still bringing in transfer portal players, which is also somewhat of a good sign for the state of the union of the program, despite all the moves that are going on, despite an interim head coach, besides not having an athletic director until literally 8 days ago. They were still able to bring in 18 transfer portal players. So if you're looking at this from a glass half full standpoint, that is interesting.
That's my other thing that makes me think that there are some things happening at Stanford that maybe they're starting to somewhat soften their whole, hey, we're going to have to change things a little bit. And a lot of the portal guys, Trevor, from okay, they let a kid in from Wake Forest. That's a really good academic school. They let a kid in from Yale, let a kid from Yarmouth, another kid from Yale, a kid from Cal, a kid from Northwestern, a kid from Georgia Tech, a kid from another kid from Northwestern, and another kid from Yale. But they also let a kid in from South Carolina State, a kid in from Wisconsin, a kid in from Colorado, a kid in from Memphis, two kids from Washington, a kid from Eastern Washington, a kid from UCF, a kid from Oregon State, a kid from Texas Tech, a kid from Sacramento State, a kid from UCLA. So there's another player from Idaho, a kid from Northern Iowa. So there's plenty of kids that they brought in that aren't from your traditional, what you'd expect to transfer to Stanford. So it does give me a little bit of a thought that maybe they're willing to work with them a little bit more. But it's going to be interesting to see what they're going to do. But they're going to have to go through high school recruiting to rebuild. That's going to be the big thing, Trev. But you want to talk about evidence of the drop-off. Let's just go back and look at the Jim Harbaugh era when he really got that thing rolling. And after that 2009 season where they went 8-5, they had 3 players drafted in the NFL draft. The next year they had 4. They had 4 the next year, and all 4 were taken in the first or second round. 3 the next year. They had 6 the next season, 6 the next season after that, including a first-round pick, a second-round pick, and 3 third-round picks. They had 5 the next season, another first-round pick, 2 first-round picks in 2017. Only 2 players picked, but it was the number 3 and number 8 overall picks. 4 players in 2018 draft, 5 players in the 2019 draft, including a second, a third, and a fourth. 2 players in 2020, and then 5 players taken in 2021. The last 4 drafts, they've had 1, 5, 1, and 1 taken in the draft, and they haven't had a single player drafted higher than the third round. And they only had 1 of those. It's been such a massive drop-off. I mean, there was a period of time where, like I said, 2012, 2 first-round draft picks, 2 second-round draft picks, a second-round pick in 13, a second-round pick in 14, a first and a second in 15, a first and a third in 16, 2 firsts in 17, a second in 2019, a second in 2021. The drop-off in talent has been noticeable, and it was stark. And a lot of it was the school just wasn't willing to support the program they needed in the ways they needed to. They weren't willing to change with the times. They weren't willing to let them offer kids sooner. They weren't willing to let in early enrollees. They weren't willing to really engage in the transfer portal. And they're so far behind right now that if they're going to make changes, it has to happen quickly. Because the roster that we're looking at right now is, in my opinion, one of the 5 best rosters in the Power 5 level. And that's probably being a bit generous. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't give Notre Dame a game if you talk about previewing Notre Dame game, because it's not much worse than the roster that they had in 2022, but it is a bad roster. And when you combine that with all the other turmoil, it's going to be a long year in Stanford. This is not the year to evaluate whether or not they're turning the corners of program. This is a survive the year and then figure out what your next steps are. That's really what this season is going to be about for Stanford, Trevor. And we could break down the players in the team, and there's some things we like. I mean, they have one of the better tight ends on the schedule that Notre Dame is going to face this season, and Sam Roush. I believe he was my second team all opponent tight end last year. The only reason he's not first or second team this year is because they play Justin Jolly and the kid from Boise State, who's a really good player, but he's a really good tight end. You and I have talked a lot last year about their running backs, and Micah Ford and Corey Davis Jr. are really good running backs. Cedric Irvin is a kid that was committed to Notre Dame for a while. They have a running back whose first name is Tuna on their team, and another running back whose name is Champ. So they definitely have a great all-name team there. Scotty Edwards is a good football player at safety. They've got a couple offensive linemen that are good players. There's some good players here, Trevor, including a couple defensive linemen that Notre Dame recruited. But overall, this is a unit that lacks speed and a unit that lacks playmaking ability. And it's just a roster that just doesn't have a lot to it. So that's going to be a struggle. You ready to go through their schedule and make some predictions, Trev?
I am ready.
All right. So let's go through it. I'm going to bring up their schedule. We'll do what we always do. Just quickly look at the schedule, and then we will make our prediction for the old Stanford Cardinal. Why don't you go ahead and kick it off, Trev?
Yep. All right. When I look at the schedule overall, I'm going to echo a lot of the similar conversations that I had when we brought up Syracuse's schedule. Look, there's at minimum 7 very losable games on this schedule. And so when I'm looking at a program like Stanford, a team like Stanford going into this season, I kind of look at the games that are winnable for them. On the road against Hawaii is doable. On the road against Virginia is doable. North Carolina, we talked about this yesterday. That is just such a wild card that I just don't know how their season is going to end up. Are they going to be one of those teams that they kind of get their feet under them and it's November and it's late in the year? And not saying they're a team that you just don't want to see, but I see North Carolina having the potential to be a much better team in November than they were in August. So that's going to be an interesting one to keep your eye out on. I think California could be a game. They don't benefit from having Wake Forest on the schedule, who, different outlets are consistently ranking Wake Forest and Stanford as the 2 bottom ACC teams this year.
And Cal's in part of that as well, yeah.
Yep. And so Cal, Wake Forest, and Stanford are kind of consistently the bottom 3 ACC teams this year in terms of, predicting where they're going to finish. As of right now, I have Stanford going 3-9. When I look at this schedule, I have them repeating what they did last year. But I don't think it's going to be, I don't want to call it as good looking of a 3-9 as last year, because 3-9 never really looks good. But to Brian's point earlier, 4 of their last 5 games were losses, but, they lose to Wake Forest by 3. They lose to Cal by 3. They lose to San Jose State by 3. I don't know if those games will be that close in losses, but I do have them going 3-9, but their 9 losses aren't going to be close. And right now, that's where I have Stanford. If it helps, their over-under on FanDuel is also set at 3.5. So I guess I'd be taking the under.
I definitely take the under 2, Trevor. I honestly, I don't know how they win more than 3 games, and I have them at 2-10. And I obviously at Hawaii is a winnable game. Look, there are several games that are winnable. They beat Louisville last year, and they beat Syracuse last year. That's a 9-win team and a 10-win team. So anything is possible. But they still only won 3 games last year with those 2 wins. But I don't think this team is as good as last year's team. Hawaii's winnable, but still going to be tough. I don't know that that's a win for them. BYU on the road should be a loss. Boston College at home is a winnable game, but that's not going to be an easy game. And if I had to pick today, I'd pick BC to win that game. At Virginia, I predict them to lose that game. I do have them beating San Jose State, but I don't feel great about that. I mean, San Jose State lost a lot, but you are going into year 2 of the Kenny and Matalolo era. So, how are they going to be in year 2? At SMU, that's going to be tough to be competitive. Home against Florida State. I know Florida State was terrible last year, but I don't think that Florida State's going to be as bad as they were last year. It's certainly possible of a win, but I think Florida State bounces back and becomes a bowl team. How will Florida State handle the travel? That's going to be a question that I have with them. It's going to be a question I have with Boston College. It's going to be a question I have with Pitt. When you look at this game, that's a big trip for them, much further than they're used to. At Miami, it's probably not going to be competitive. At North Carolina, maybe winnable, but I think North Carolina's got some talent. Then you're home against Pitt. So, and then home against Cal. The Cal game is winnable. Cal had a rough offseason as well. At one point, their entire backfield transferred this summer, it was actually after the spring. They lost some guys in the fall or in the winter, and then lost some more in the spring. Entire backfield left. There's some talent issues there as well, and Justin Wilcox is dealing with a school that doesn't really support the program the way it should either. So that's a winnable game. There's just not a lot of winnable games outside of them just pulling off some massive upset, which is certainly possible. Trev, they've gone 3-9 in each of the last 3 years. And actually, no, did they go 2-8 in 2022? Hold on real quick. Let me look up. Or 2022, they went 3-9. They've gone 3-9, 3-9, 3-9. They've been bad. But that's 9-27, correct? But they have beat Notre Dame. They beat Arizona State. They beat Colorado on the road. They beat Washington State on the road. They beat Syracuse on the road. They beat Louisville. Those are good wins. So they're a very weird team in that regard. But this is the last 3-9 teams, this roster, in my opinion, is worse than those teams. So I have them at 2-10, 3-9, certainly possible, but I actually think they take a bit of a step back this year. So that's my prediction for the old Stanford Cardinal, Trev.
We see them very much the same. Well, listen, folks, that's going to do it for our recap of Stanford. Going to do it for the overview of the Stanford Cardinal. Set up for a rough year, but again, it's Notre Dame's final opponent of the 2025 regular season. They play them on the road. Kickoff time yet to be determined. But don't go anywhere, guys. It is Friday. We have a Friday free-for-all mailbag coming up. But before we get there, be sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell. Share this podcast with your friends and family. Anybody that you know loves Notre Dame, college football as much as you do. But as always, the best way to support what we do here, you see it scrolling down there at the bottom of the screen. Subscribe to the premium message boards at boards.irishbreakdown.com.